Hey guys, this is Anthony. I'm gonna share my answers that I got for the Module 4 discussion board. Um, so for Chapter 3, one of the questions that I chose was number 1, using the concept of systemic racism as discussed in our text, explain how racism in the criminal justice system affects Black and Latino immigrants. Um, well, first off, systemic racism is a diverse assortment of racist practices, including white racist ideologies, attitudes, and institutions, as well as resource inequalities. So, law enforcement officers, of course, carry greater power with them than regular citizens. So, if those officers have white racist ideologies, they can bring that with them to their work and kind of make choices that reflect those beliefs. Um, and these citizens don't have the power to oppose them because obviously they're a police officer, so they're gonna have to kind of just get the brunt of it. Um, Black and Latinos are primarily they're like the primary target for officers like this. Um, so they're subject to abuse and harassment more often, I think, because usually police like to patrol these Black and Latino neighborhoods because they just assume that there's more crime there just because of the ideologies that they carry with them. So there's more often than not there's people on patrol at those neighborhoods rather than the white neighborhoods because they perceive it to be more safe and like just to have less crime than an average Black or Latino neighborhood. So these white neighborhoods really they don't get as much arrests as the other neighborhoods do because there's not as much police patrolling there. So that's what kind of contributes to this disparity in the criminal justice system, where whites aren't really present as much as Blacks or Latinos because they're not really around police officials as often as these other races are. So the other question that I chose to do for chapter 3 was question 2. Um, Using your text, identify and discuss 3 ways in which contemporary nativism differs from the nativism of a century ago. Use your text to support your answer. Provide 2 specific examples of contemporary nativism. So, the relationship between last century's nativism and contemporary nativism is kind of the same as the relationship between old and new racism that we talked about last module. Um, it's kind of become more covert, less noticeable. They really don't make like overt statements like they did with, or like similarly to the old and new racism. Um, and so it also differs because people of last century were more concerned with like the eugenic practices of nativism, and this century they're more concerned about kind of like money based materialistic materials, um, like welfare or education or funding, because some people believe that immigrants are draining or overusing resources when they're compared to like the average American. Um, in the book, it states that some politicians would suggest that foreign-born children were draining funds by using the education system just because they were foreign-born, um, and that position could be filled by a native-born individual. And also, now people are more concerned with keeping traditional like white values, as the text states. Um, and one example of that is the campaign of Press One for English, where people were kind of against the fact that Spanish was coming into America as like a dominant language, or that they were afraid that it would become the dominant language because they wanted English to be America's language because it was like their original language. Um, Things like that is like the difference between this nativism and last century. So for chapter 4, um, I chose question 1, which is using the text, identify and discuss a specific example where an African American athlete's behavior is depicted differently than her or his wife's counterpart who engaged in the same behavior. Explain how this different depiction shapes the U.S. racial order. Um, and an example of that is on page 96 of the textbook. The author discusses the incident between Kobe Bryant and Drew Henson. And Kobe Bryant, who is a black man, announced that he wasn't going to be attending school full time. And so when he announced this, the media kind of made statements saying that he needed like training or refinement, or that he was lacking discipline and that he was making a bad decision. But when Drew Henson did the same thing, who is white, the media did not concentrate on the same things that they did with Kobe Bryant. They didn't talk about anything regarding his maturity or upward mobility. And another example is from the textbook is between Lawrence Phillips and Christian Peter. Lawrence Phillips and Christian Peter were both Nebraska State football players, and they were both charged with beating their girlfriends. Lawrence's ex-girlfriend, actually. But Lawrence Phillips was black, so when the media covered it, it kind of reached the whole nation instead of just Nebraska, and it was covered like everywhere. There was like a 60 Minutes news interview about him and everything. But with Christian Peter, the news kind of only spread as far as Lincoln, Nebraska, which was the city that they were in. And that's kind of a drastic difference for people that came from the same background, did the same thing. So the other question that I chose for chapter 4 is question 2. It's define controlling images, select a common racial stereotype promoted by the media, and use the concept of controlling images to explain how the stereotype justifies and reinforces inequality. A common racial stereotype that's even highlighted in the book is that African Americans are depicted as like thugs and criminals. An example of the media promoting this is with the case of Michael Brown, which was an African American boy from a town called Ferguson. He was a victim of a police brutality case, and he was shot and unfortunately killed by the officer. But the controversy is when NBC went to cover the story, they posted a picture of Michael Brown wearing a Nike jersey, and he was flashing a sign that some people might have thought to be a gang sign, and others thought it was a peace sign. But this was a case of them trying to fit Michael Brown into a certain stereotype that people believed in. But there was also another picture of Michael Brown that was of him in a graduating cap and gown, and people were starting to question why they didn't choose that picture instead of the picture that they did choose. And so eventually NBC took down the original picture, and just to avoid all the backlash. And acts like this, mainly, they promote inequality because they attempt to explain instances of things like police brutality as something that like the victim, it was warranted for the victim, kind of like making him appear as a criminal or a thug just by the clothes that he was wearing. And they try to paint a picture of people of a certain race falling into a certain stereotype so that kind of people reserve their sympathy for them based on what they assume from their looks. So things like this is what attempts to promote and kind of mostly justify inequality. So that was all my answers for the Module 4 discussion board. Thank you all for watching the video, and I am ready to see your guys' explanations of these answers. See you in the discussion board.